Ancient empires sold war as courage, order, and destiny. The battlefield disagreed. Today, we open 10 case files on weapons that broke imperial confidence. The first 9 expose fear by engineering, while the final iron-tubed anomaly forces a colder question: who really owned progress? Chapter 1. Greek Fire. The Byzantine weapon that made water burn. Case file number 1 opens on the dark water outside Constantinople. You stand on the deck of a wooden warship, close enough to smell pitch, salt, sweat, and the animal panic of men trying very hard to look imperial. Ahead, the Byzantine capital rises behind its walls, layered in stone, prayer, and bureaucracy. Behind you, commanders promise victory. In front of you, a strange bronze-mouthed device turns toward the sea. Then the water catches fire. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Fire moves across the surface as if the ocean itself has changed sides. Ships that expected arrows and boarding hooks now face liquid flame, sprayed from Byzantine dromons through siphons mounted like naval throats. Men jump into the sea because every sane human knows water kills fire. Here, it does not. A very poor day for common sense. If this weapon is understood correctly, then ancient naval warfare was not just ramming, boarding, and disciplined courage. It was also chemistry, state secrecy, controlled terror, and the kind of imperial weapons program that makes modern intelligence agencies look slightly less original. The weapon is known as Greek Fire, though the name itself is already a historical compromise. To the Byzantines, it was part of a guarded military system. Its most famous early association comes during the Arab siege of Constantinople between 674 and 678 CE. It appears again with decisive force during the siege of 717 to 718 CE, when Byzantine survival depended on more than courage and nice walls. The device was delivered from warships called dromons, often through pressurized siphons. Its recipe remains unknown, but scholars commonly suspect some mixture involving petroleum, resin, sulfur, quicklime, or other incendiary substances. Its battlefield signature was simple and horrifying. It continued burning on water. That single detail breaks the ordinary frame. Ancient naval combat had rules. Brutal rules, yes, but still rules. Ships rammed, marines boarded, archers fired, sailors shouted, everyone got wet. Greek fire changed the emotional contract of sea war. It did not ask soldiers to be brave in the familiar way. It asked them to remain calm while the surface of the sea behaved like a furnace with administrative backing. The traditional human anchor behind this weapon is Callinicos of Heliopolis, a Syrian Greek engineer, said to have brought the formula to Constantinople in the 7th century. Whether the story is complete or polished by later memory, the context matters. Byzantium was losing territory to expanding Arab power. The empire did not need a heroic statue, it needed survival. It needed something that could protect the capital when theology, diplomacy, and marble architecture were not quite enough, so the contradiction sits in plain sight. A medieval empire, often treated by lazy summaries as a decorative leftover of Rome, appears to have operated a strategic incendiary technology with strict secrecy, specialized delivery systems, naval integration, and psychological doctrine. In other words, not a random flaming bucket. Not a campfire with ambition, a controlled state weapon. The engineering problem was severe. A ship-mounted flame weapon had to store dangerous material, project it toward enemy vessels, avoid burning its own crew alive, operate under combat conditions, and produce a substance terrifying enough to ruin an enemy's will before boarding even began. That required materials knowledge, mechanical design, crew training, and discipline. The flame mattered. The system mattered more. And that is where power enters the room, quietly wearing official robes. Greek fire was not just protected because it was useful. It was protected because it was political insurance. If rival states acquired the formula, Constantinople's naval advantage weakened. If rebels acquired it, the empire's own ports could become targets. If provincial commanders controlled it independently, the capital's monopoly on survival fractured. So the weapon had to be locked inside imperial structures. Guarded workshops, controlled crews, limited transmission, and probably a great deal of professional silence. That silence worked too well. The formula disappeared. Not because ancient people were stupid. Not because medieval scribes forgot how to write things down. The more uncomfortable possibility is that the secrecy succeeded. The weapon was compartmentalized so effectively that when the institutions protecting it weakened, the knowledge did not pass easily into the open world. It vanished into the ruins of the bureaucracy that had kept it alive. A rare case where government secrecy was efficient. Disturbing, really. The orthodox textbook explanation is usually neat. Greek fire was an early flamethrower, a clever incendiary device used by the Byzantines in naval warfare. This is technically reasonable. It is also emotionally inadequate. Calling Greek fire an early flamethrower is like calling a nuclear submarine a large bathtub. It identifies the shape of the idea while missing the entire strategic horror. The flame was only one layer. The deeper weapon was secrecy. The deeper system was naval projection. The deeper result was psychological dominance. Enemy fleets did not merely fear being hit. They feared not understanding what had hit them. That matters. Terror grows best in the gap between damage and explanation. The mainstream version becomes highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math of empire starts breaking through the page. If Greek fire was just another incendiary mixture, why did its exact recipe remain so elusive? If it was merely a crude flame device, why did it acquire such legendary military weight? If its terror was exaggerated, why do repeated accounts place it at moments when Byzantine survival was not theoretical, but immediate? One cautious hypothesis is that Greek fire was not a single recipe, but a family of guarded incendiary technologies refined over time. Another is that the delivery system mattered as much as the substance, meaning later imitators could know parts of the chemistry and still fail to reproduce the battlefield effect. A third is that the legend grew because the weapon struck the most vulnerable part of naval warfare. Not the hull, but morale. Men can be ordered to face swords. Ordering them to face burning water requires a more optimistic human resources department. So the case refuses to close neatly. Was Greek fire a chemical breakthrough or an institutional breakthrough disguised as chemistry? Did Byzantium survive because it had the best walls, or because it understood that fear could be manufactured, stored, and sprayed from a ship? And if secrecy itself can become a weapon, how many lost technologies were not forgotten by accident, but buried successfully by the people who depended on them? The cold lesson is not that ancient people were secretly modern. That is too easy. The lesson is worse. Ancient states already understood something modern states pretend they invented. Knowledge is power only when access is controlled. And from burning water, the investigation moves inland, toward a different kind of terror. No secret formula this time. No flame crawling across the sea. Just walls, stone, ramps, engineers, and an empire that looked at fortified cities and saw temporary obstacles with bad long-term prospects. Chapter 2. The Assyrian Siege Engine, the machine that taught cities to fear walls. The second entry in the archive begins at Lachish, in 701 BCE. You stand inside a fortified city of Judah, looking down from the wall at a landscape that no longer behaves like landscape. It is moving. Dust rises beyond the city. Men carry stones. Others drag timber. Archers step forward behind shields. Engineers measure the slope toward your defenses with the calm attention of people planning a road, except the road ends at your death. Below, the Assyrian army does not look like a mob. It looks like a department. That is the problem. A wall is supposed to create certainty. It turns fear into architecture. It tells the people inside that the world may burn, but at least the stones will hold. Then Assyria arrives and treats the wall as a temporary inconvenience. Not a sacred boundary, not a political statement, a construction challenge. If the evidence at Lachish is read seriously, then ancient siege warfare was not just patience, starvation, and shouting outside gates. It was organized engineering under combat pressure, supported by imperial logistics, protected by archers, and repeated with enough confidence to make fortified independence feel negotiable. The object at the center of this case is not a single machine, but a siege system. Assyrian ramps, battering rams, shielded infantry, archers, and assault coordination. The date is 701 BCE. The ruler is Sennacherib, king of Assyria. The target is Lachish, one of Judah's most important fortified cities after Jerusalem. The evidence includes detailed palace reliefs from Nineveh showing the siege, the deportation of captives, the use of assault machines, and the calm visual grammar of imperial punishment. On the ground, the siege ramp at Lachish remains one of the clearest archaeological examples of ancient Near Eastern siege engineering. The numbers do not need theatrical inflation, the facts are already rude enough. A fortified hill city, a constructed ramp, shielded troops, approaching walls, battering rams under fire, archers suppressing defenders, organized assault waves. A state powerful enough to move labor, materials, food, weapons, and administrators across conquered space, then turn all of it against a single defensive point. This is the physical contradiction. City walls were designed to stop armies. Assyria built a method that made walls part of the battlefield schedule. The engineering was not simple. A ramp had to rise at the correct angle toward the city wall. It required stone, earth, timber, labor, and protection from defenders above. The battering ram had to survive missiles, fire, falling stones, and panic. Archers had to suppress the parapets while engineers worked below. Infantry had to be held ready for the breach. Commanders had to coordinate pressure long enough for the defenders to understand the terrible message. Your wall is no longer a wall. It is a countdown. This is why Assyrian power frightened the ancient Near East. The empire did not merely possess violent men. Everyone had violent men. Assyria possessed procedure. It could turn destruction into an administrative cycle. Identify city. Isolate city. Build ramp. Break wall. Deport population. Record victory. Decorate palace. Very tasteful if one's interior design philosophy is organized trauma. For small kingdoms, this was politically catastrophic. Fortified cities were not only military assets, they were statements of sovereignty. A wall said, "Here authority begins." It protected grain stores, temples, elites, tax records, families, and the symbolic dignity of local rule. Once Assyria developed reliable methods to break fortified cities, the political meaning of walls changed. They still mattered, but they no longer guaranteed independence. Sovereignty became conditional. Stone had to negotiate with engineering. The people most threatened were not only soldiers. Kings were threatened. Priests were threatened. Local elites were threatened. Every authority structure that depended on the idea of a protected center had to face the Assyrian conclusion. Centers can be reached. Walls can be climbed. Gates can be smashed. Populations can be moved. Your gods may be powerful, but they appear to have limited ramp interdiction capacity. The erasure layer is subtle. Later empires borrowed Assyrian lessons while often softening Assyrian memory into a general reputation for cruelty. Cruelty, of course, was real, but reducing Assyrian warfare to brutality misses the more dangerous fact. Brutality alone does not explain Lachish. Rage does not build a siege ramp. Sadism does not coordinate artillery, infantry, labor, and propaganda. Assyria's terror came from the marriage of violence and method. That is why the palace reliefs matter. They are not random illustrations, they are imperial messaging. Sennacherib did not merely want Lachish conquered. He wanted the conquest displayed. He wanted viewers to see defenders impaled, captives deported, soldiers advancing, machines functioning, and the king's power made visible through process. The reliefs are evidence and advertisement, ancient public relations with fewer smiling families and more consequences. The Orthodox textbook narrative usually frames ancient sieges as armies surrounding cities until hunger or betrayal did the work. This is fair in many cases. Starvation mattered. Negotiation mattered. Disease mattered. But at Lachish, waiting was not the whole story. The Assyrians were not simply camping outside and hoping morale would become fragile. They were actively redesigning the relationship between attacker and wall. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the stones start moving uphill. Because the siege ramp changes the math. The wall's height is no longer a fixed advantage if the attacker can build the ground upward. The defender's position is no longer secure if archers can suppress movement along the parapet. The gate is no longer the only weak point if battering rams and assault paths can be engineered toward vulnerable sections. The city is not merely surrounded, it is being solved. Very rude behavior toward architecture. There are cautious alternatives to the simplified view. One possibility is that Assyrian siege warfare should be understood as an early form of combined arms engineering, where machines, missile troops, labor forces, and psychological display operated as one system. Another is that Lachish was not an exceptional miracle of Assyrian technique, but a preserved example of a broader imperial method used repeatedly across the region. A third possibility is that the greatest Assyrian weapon was not any single ram or ramp, but the predictability of imperial punishment. Cities did not only fear the breach. They feared what came after the breach because Assyria had made aftermath part of policy, and policy travels farther than arrows. So the questions begin to stack. When a wall fails, does it fail as stone or as political imagination? How many ancient kingdoms collapsed not because they lacked courage, but because their defensive assumptions had expired? And if an empire can turn siegecraft into routine, is its real weapon the battering ram, or the paperwork that ensures another battering ram arrives tomorrow? The lesson is cold and durable. Empires are not built only by warriors with dramatic profiles. They are built by systems that make destruction repeatable. The heroic soldier may enter the breach, but the engineer decides where the breach will be. The administrator makes sure the engineer has stone. The king takes credit, naturally. From the walls of Lachish, the trail moves away from cities entirely. Because some enemies did not wait behind stone, some refused the whole premise of fixed defense and fixed battle. They came from open grasslands carrying compact bows made of wood, horn, sinew, and insult. Assyria taught cities that walls could be broken. The steppe would teach empires something even more irritating. Some enemies cannot be pinned down long enough to break. Chapter 3. The Scythian Composite Bow. The small weapon that humiliated heavy empires. The third anomaly on our list takes us to the Pontic steppe. You are on horseback before sunrise, surrounded by grassland so wide it makes borders look like a clerical hallucination. The wind cuts across your face. Your legs grip the animal beneath you. In your hand is a bow small enough to use from the saddle, but complex enough to make settled empires deeply uncomfortable. Far away, an imperial army tries to organize itself into something impressive. Infantry, armor, standards, officers, the reassuring geometry of civilization. Then the riders begin to move. They do not line up politely. They do not present a fixed target. They approach, shoot, wheel away, vanish, return, and turn distance into a weapon. The empire wants a battle. The steppe offers a conversation conducted entirely in arrows. If this system is understood properly, the old textbook division between civilized armies and primitive raiders begins to collapse in a very inconvenient way. Because the Scythian mounted archer was not a chaotic nuisance. He was the human expression of a military technology designed for speed, endurance, deception, and humiliation. The weapon is the Scythian Composite Bow. Its materials were ordinary only if listed lazily: wood, horn, sinew, animal glue. But the design was not ordinary. The bow stored energy through layers of material working under different forms of stress. Horn resisted compression, sinew resisted tension. Wood gave structure. Glue held the whole argument together. Some reconstructions exceed 45 kilograms of draw weight. Archaeological finds associated with Scythian-style bows and related steppe traditions stretch across the Eurasian steppe and into regions such as Xinjiang. Composite bow technology entered Egypt and the Near East no later than the 2nd millennium BCE, and its tactical logic shaped warfare from the Near East to Central Asia for centuries. A compact bow. Organic materials. Mounted use. High draw weight, long tradition. Wide geographic spread. The data window is not decorative. It matters because the paradox depends on scale. The object itself was relatively small. It could be carried on horseback, used in motion, and handled in a world where the rider's body, the horse's rhythm, and the bow's stored energy became one moving weapons platform. A large self-bow could be powerful, but it was awkward on horseback. A composite bow compressed power into portability. That is not primitive. That is design intelligence under environmental pressure. Settled empires often built their military identity around visible mass. Heavy infantry, fortified cities, armored elites, chariots, roads, camps, supply depots. The Scythian archer attacked all of those assumptions by refusing to become the kind of enemy imperial systems preferred. He did not need to hold territory in the same way. He did not need to accept battle on imperial terms. He could strike, retreat, circle, exhaust, and return with the irritating confidence of someone who had read the empire's doctrine and decided not to participate. Very inconsiderate. The engineering difficulty was not only in the bow, it was in the culture required to use it. A composite bow took specialized craftsmanship, careful curing, material knowledge, and maintenance. Animal glue and sinew did not forgive sloppy handling. The bow had to perform in weather, movement, and stress. Then the rider had to shoot accurately from horseback, often while moving at speed, sometimes while retreating, twisting, and aiming backward. A settled infantryman could be trained. A steppe archer had to be grown. That is where politics enters the case. Empires feared nomadic archers because they exposed the fantasy at the center of imperial control. Tax systems assume people can be counted. Borders assume movement can be restricted. Forts assume threats will approach from known directions. Roads assume the state controls the path. The steppe laughed at all of this with excellent posture and a functioning bowstring. Nomadic warfare threatened the profits and authority of settled states. Agricultural empires depended on land, harvests, storage, taxation, and predictable routes. A mobile enemy could raid supply lines, avoid heavy retaliation, and force rulers into expensive frontier defense. The empire had to build forts, recruit cavalry, negotiate tribute, revise doctrine, and explain to the public why the supposedly superior state kept being embarrassed by people living beyond its paperwork. That explanation was usually simple. Call them barbarians. This is one of history's most reliable public relations techniques. If an outsider defeats you, he is not tactically superior. He is savage. If he avoids your army, he is cowardly. If he uses mobility well, he lacks honor. If he forces you to change your entire military system, he remains primitive but in a very administratively disruptive way. The orthodox textbook explanation often describes nomadic steppe peoples as raiders. Fast, violent, disruptive, but somehow less sophisticated than the civilizations they threatened. This is partially fair only if the word raider is allowed to carry the weight of strategy, engineering, horse culture, logistics, intelligence, and psychological warfare. Usually it is not. Usually it is a polite way of saying, they did not build enough stone monuments for us to take them seriously. This textbook narrative is tidy and very comforting until the battlefield refuses to stand still, because heavy infantry cannot dominate what it cannot catch. Fortified cities cannot intimidate riders who do not need to occupy them immediately. Armored elites cannot prove superiority if the enemy keeps killing horses, cutting supplies, and avoiding decisive engagement. The empire may possess more metal, more soldiers, more scribes, and better ceremonial hats. None of that matters when the opponent has made distance itself into armor. The mainstream simplification fails because the Scythian Composite Bow was not merely a weapon of attack. It was a weapon of refusal. It refused the infantry square. It refused the heroic duel. It refused the siege timetable. It refused the imperial desire for a clean victory that could be carved into stone afterward. One cautious hypothesis is that the composite bow's real power came from the complete tactical ecosystem around it. Horse breeding, childhood riding, mobile encampments, flexible command, and deep familiarity with terrain. Another is that settled chroniclers underestimated steppe technology because it was made from perishable materials rather than monumental stone. A third is that the psychological effect of mounted archers was as important as physical casualties. The targeted army felt itself losing control before it was destroyed. That feeling is expensive. It makes kings nervous. Nervous kings make bad decisions and long inscriptions. So the questions sharpen. What counts as advanced technology if the materials rot before museums can display them? How much history has been misread because settled writers confused mobility with simplicity? And if an empire cannot force an enemy to fight conventionally, is the empire still powerful or merely well-dressed and frustrated? The cold insight is that sophistication does not always look like cities. Sometimes it leaves no palace, no column, no official archive. Sometimes it looks like a rider turning in the saddle, loosing an arrow, and disappearing before the empire has finished explaining why he should not matter. From the open steppe, the investigation moves into a very different machine of control. Not fluid grassland, but standardized workshops. Not riders escaping the state, but the state manufacturing violence with inspection marks. The Scythian bow humiliated empires by refusing bureaucracy. The Qin crossbow did the opposite. It showed what happens when bureaucracy learns how to pull a trigger. Chapter 4. The Qin crossbow, the trigger mechanism behind unification. Our fourth stop breaks the timeline in 221 BCE, the year China was forced into unity with the tenderness normally associated with legal codes, mass labor, and extremely practical weapons. You stand inside a Qin workshop before the empire has finished becoming an empire. The air smells of bronze, charcoal, sweat, and supervision. Somewhere nearby, an inspector marks a component, not because he loves art, because someone will be held responsible if the weapon fails. On a table lies a crossbow trigger mechanism. It does not look like destiny. It looks like parts, bronze pieces, pins, levers. A controlled release system designed to turn stored tension into repeatable violence. Yet this small mechanical assembly belongs to a larger truth. Qin conquest was not just the story of a ruthless state defeating rival kingdoms. It was the story of administration discovering that war becomes far more efficient when killing can be standardized. A heroic sword requires a heroic hand. A crossbow requires a trained operator, a working trigger, a supply chain, and a government unpleasant enough to make sure all four arrive on time. If this mechanism is taken seriously, then the unification of China cannot be understood only as discipline, harsh law, or the will of Qin Shi Huang. Those mattered, but behind them stood workshops, measurements, metallurgical consistency, and weapons inspection. The empire did not simply command violence, it manufactured it. The weapon is the Qin Crossbow, especially the bronze trigger mechanisms found in connection with the terracotta army pits near the mausoleum of the first emperor. The political date is 221 BCE, when Qin completed the conquest of the rival warring states and unified China. The archaeological record includes large numbers of bronze weapons, crossbow trigger components, spearheads, halberds, swords, and arrowheads. The trigger mechanisms were multi-part bronze devices. Studies of the weapons suggest standardization, specialized production, and a high degree of organizational control. Crossbows also required less lifelong elite training than traditional high-skill archery, making them suitable for broader deployment. The data cluster is not ornamental. A unified empire in 221 BCE terracotta pits filled with real weapon systems. Bronze trigger assemblies made from separate interacting parts. Evidence of standardized manufacture, marks linked to accountability and workshop organization. A weapon that translated mechanical design into mass military usefulness. That is the contradiction. Ancient battle is often imagined as individual courage. The warrior, the blade, the duel, the glorious scream. The Qin crossbow quietly insults this image. It says that the decisive moment may not be the warrior's soul. It may be whether a bronze latch releases cleanly after being produced under state supervision. The engineering challenge was formidable. A crossbow stores energy in a drawn bow assembly and releases it through a trigger. That trigger must hold tension reliably, then release predictably. If the parts are badly cast, badly fitted, or badly maintained, the weapon fails. If each workshop produces incompatible components, repair and supply become chaos. If training is inconsistent, the advantage disappears. Qin power lay in connecting the mechanical object to the administrative environment around it. This was not simply a bow placed sideways for convenience. It was a system of repeatability. The crossbow also changed the social politics of violence. Elite archery required years of practice. Aristocratic warfare loved that arrangement because expensive skill protects status. The more difficult a weapon is to master, the easier it is for elite classes to claim that battlefield power belongs naturally to them. The crossbow disrupted this romance. It did not erase training, but it reduced the gap between hereditary skill and state-organized effectiveness. A disciplined soldier with a mechanical trigger could threaten men whose identities were built around martial exclusivity. Very offensive to hereditary self-esteem. The Qin state was already hostile to older aristocratic assumptions. Its power came from centralization, legalism, measurements, roads, labor organization, taxation, rank incentives, punishments, and military merit. The crossbow fits this world perfectly. It is not a noble weapon in the poetic sense. It is a bureaucratic weapon. It rewards standard parts, mass deployment, inspection, storage, and coordination. The Qin did not need every soldier to be a legendary archer. They needed thousands of weapons that worked the same way under pressure. This is where power becomes uncomfortable. Later moral histories often condemned Qin tyranny, and for good reason. The Qin state was harsh, coercive, and deeply comfortable with human exhaustion. But moral condemnation can obscure technical clarity. Qin brutality was not effective merely because it was brutal. Many states are brutal. They do not all unify China. Qin power was frightening because coercion was tied to systems that functioned. Roads moved armies, laws enforced production, measures standardized exchange, and weapons reflected state control. A bad government can shout orders. Qin could equip the orders. The erasure layer comes from the way history prefers personalities. Qin Shi Huang dominates the frame. The first emperor, the tomb, the terracotta soldiers, the burning of books, the search for immortality, the grand paranoia of rule. These are memorable. A bronze trigger is less dramatic. It does not look insane enough for television. But the trigger may reveal more about how conquest actually worked than another story about imperial ambition. Kings want immortality. Armies need functioning parts. The orthodox textbook explanation says Qin unified China through discipline, harsh laws, military organization, and centralized rule. This is not wrong. It is simply incomplete in the way a skeleton is incomplete without muscles, tendons, organs, and a tax office. Harsh laws alone do not fire bolts. Discipline alone does not standardize bronze. Centralization alone does not matter unless it reaches the workshop bench. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the trigger mechanism clicks. because that click contains the empire. The mine that produced the copper and tin, the foundry that cast the parts, the craftsman who shaped them, the inspector who marked them, the officer who distributed them, the soldier who carried them, the commander who planned around them, the legal system that punished failure, the ruler who claimed destiny after everyone else did the measurable work. Naturally, destiny gets the better monument. The simplistic version also misses the psychological effect. A crossbow in mass use changes how enemies think about distance. It allows less elite troops to project lethal force with mechanical assistance. It makes armor, formations, and advances more dangerous. It gives the state a way to convert ordinary bodies into coordinated missile power. The weapon democratizes a portion of battlefield lethality, though under state command, which is democracy in the same way a prison schedule is time management. Alternative explanations should remain cautious. One hypothesis is that the Qin crossbow's importance lay less in any single technical breakthrough and more in the integration of production, accountability, and deployment. Another is that standardization across Qin weapons was uneven, but still powerful enough to reflect a state far more administratively sophisticated than older heroic narratives allow. A third is that the true revolution was not the crossbow alone, but the Qin ability to combine mechanical weapons with legal coercion, military merit, and logistical reach. The questions are not comfortable. When a state standardizes violence, is the weapon still the object, or the bureaucracy behind it? Did Qin win because its soldiers were braver, or because its system made courage less important than repeatable function? And how often do we mistake ancient conquest for personality when the real author is procurement? The independent lesson is brutally modern. Empire begins when power stops relying on exceptional individuals and learns to reproduce itself through parts, forms, rules, and fear. The Qin crossbow is not just a weapon. It is a small bronze argument that the state can mechanize death and call the result order. From that workshop, the case file turns toward the sea again, but not toward flame. This time, the innovation is embarrassingly physical. Rome faces Carthage, a naval power with generations of maritime skill. Rome has soldiers, confidence, and a problem. It is not Carthage. So Rome builds a bridge, drops it onto enemy ships, and solves naval warfare with the subtle elegance of a man kicking down the wrong door and calling it strategy. Chapter 5. The Roman Corvus. The boarding bridge that turned sea war into street fighting. Number 5 begins on the deck of a Roman warship in 260 BCE at the Battle of Mylae. You stand among soldiers who are pretending very hard to be sailors. The sea shifts under their feet with insulting confidence. Ahead, Carthaginian ships move with the ease of crews born into maritime power. Their oars bite the water cleanly. Their commanders understand wind, angle, speed, and ramming distance. Rome understands infantry. This is not a small problem. Carthage has ships, sailors, trade networks, and a long naval tradition. Rome has discipline, stubbornness, and the deeply Roman belief that every problem becomes simpler if enough soldiers can reach it with weapons. The question is how to put Roman infantry onto Carthaginian decks without first becoming competent at naval warfare, which would take time, experience, and humility. Rome chooses a fourth option: build an awkward boarding bridge and make the enemy regret having a deck. The device is called the Corvus, the Raven. According to Polybius, it was roughly 36 feet long and 4 feet wide, mounted near the prow of Roman ships, and fitted with an iron spike or beak that could drop onto an enemy vessel and grip its deck. The First Punic War lasted from 264 to 241 BCE. The Battle of Mylae occurred in 260 BCE. Rome's commander was Gaius Duilius. Carthage entered the war as the superior naval power. The Corvus allowed Roman marines to board enemy ships and transform sea combat into infantry fighting. There is the data cluster in its most embarrassing form. A 36-foot bridge, 4 feet wide, iron spike, First Punic War, Battle of Mylae, Roman marines, Carthaginian naval superiority, one crude mechanical answer to a strategic skill gap. The physical contradiction is beautiful because it is so blunt. Naval warfare in the Western Mediterranean depended on maneuver, ramming, seamanship, hull control, and trained crews. Rome looked at that complex environment and said, essentially, what if the sea battle became a street fight, but wetter? This was not elegant innovation. It was tactical vandalism. The engineering challenge was not negligible. The Corvus had to be mounted on a ship without making the vessel useless. It had to pivot or drop quickly. Its iron spike had to bite into an enemy deck. It had to remain stable enough for armed men to cross while both ships moved on water, surrounded by shouting, impact, splinters, and the general atmosphere of poor life choices. A failed Corvus could mean chaos. A successful one changed the battle's grammar. Before the Corvus, Carthage wanted distance and movement. It wanted to ram, outmaneuver, and exploit naval experience. After the Corvus dropped, the fight changed. The Carthaginian ship was no longer simply a vessel. It was suddenly a platform for Roman infantry combat. Rome did not need to outsail Carthage if it could force Carthage into a military language Rome already spoke fluently. That is why the Corvus terrified a naval empire. It attacked expertise itself. Carthage's maritime advantage was not just technical, it was political and economic. Its power came from trade routes, colonies, ports, shipbuilding, sailors, navigational experience, and confidence at sea. Naval superiority was a cultural inheritance. It told Carthage that the sea was not neutral ground. It was home territory. The Corvus challenged that monopoly by making elite seamanship less decisive at the moment of contact. Rome's invention was almost offensive in its simplicity. If you are bad at the enemy's game, force the enemy to play yours. If the opponent has generations of naval skill, do not politely spend generations catching up. Build a bridge with a metal tooth and import the land war. A very Roman solution. Not subtle. Effective enough to be irritating. But the Corvus also carries a paradox. The same device that helped Rome win boarding actions may have made Roman ships less stable, especially in rough weather. Ancient sources and modern historians have debated whether the heavy bridge contributed to naval losses in storms. The case remains cautious, not theatrical. But the strategic possibility matters. Rome's tactical solution may have created a maritime liability. The Corvus could help win battles while making fleets more vulnerable outside battle. That is the kind of innovation empires often love. Brilliant in one context, dangerous in another, and explained afterward by someone not currently drowning. The systemic layer is clear. The Corvus threatened Carthage because it reduced the protective value of inherited maritime skill. It gave Rome a shortcut. Shortcuts are politically frightening when used by rivals with enormous manpower and no shame about adaptation. Carthage may have had better sailors, but Rome had a talent for absorbing failure and returning with hardware. Later, Roman memory preferred cleaner explanations. Rome won because of courage, discipline, toughness, destiny, civic virtue, and all the usual marble vocabulary. The Corvus is less glamorous. It suggests that Rome's early naval success depended partly on an ungainly mechanical cheat code. This does not make Roman courage fake. It makes the story more interesting, which is often why official memory dislikes it. The Orthodox textbook version says Rome defeated Carthage because Roman soldiers were tougher, more disciplined, and more persistent. There is truth there. Roman persistence was frightening. Roman discipline mattered. Roman manpower mattered. But toughness alone does not explain how Roman infantry physically reached Carthaginian decks during naval combat. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until one asks the impolite mechanical question, where did the soldiers walk? Across the Corvus. The bridge is the missing sentence. It is the plank between Roman identity and Carthaginian vulnerability. Without it, Roman infantry remains trapped on Roman ships, having brave thoughts at an unhelpful distance. With it, the enemy ship becomes a temporary extension of Roman land warfare. The sea remains the sea, technically. Rome simply refuses to respect the category. The mainstream simplification also misses the psychological insult. The Corvus did not merely kill sailors, it humiliated a naval culture by making its greatest skill less relevant at close range. Imagine training for years to master movement, ramming, and maritime tactics, only for the enemy to attach a front porch to your warship and arrive with swords. The disrespect is almost architectural. Alternative hypotheses remain cautious. One possibility is that the Corvus was decisive early in the war, but became less useful as Roman naval skill improved and the dangers of instability became clearer. Another is that its importance has been exaggerated by ancient narrative because it neatly symbolizes Roman adaptation. A third is that the Corvus was not a miracle weapon, but a transitional tool. A brutal temporary solution that bought Rome time while it learned how to become a naval power. And that may be the deeper point. Transitional tools change history precisely because they do not have to last forever. They only have to survive long enough to alter the balance. So the questions tighten. Is innovation still brilliant if it is ugly, temporary, and slightly dangerous to its users? Did Rome defeat Carthage at sea by mastering naval warfare, or by refusing to accept naval warfare's rules until mastery became possible? And how many empires owe their rise not to superior tradition, but to shameless improvisation at the exact moment tradition becomes inconvenient? The cold lesson is that power does not always innovate by refinement. Sometimes it innovates by violating categories. The Corvus was not graceful. It was not elegant. It was a bridge with a beak, dropped between two ships so infantry could do what infantry does. A wooden confession that Rome had a problem and an iron refusal to solve it politely. From this floating street fight, the archive moves to Syracuse, where Rome met a different kind of resistance. No crude bridge this time, no blunt shortcut across a deck. Instead, a city under siege armed itself with mathematics, leverage, cranes, catapults, and one elderly mind so dangerous that Roman soldiers learned to fear geometry. The next weapon was not merely built. It was calculated. Chapter 6. Archimedes' Siege Machines. The mathematics that made Rome bleed. The sixth fragment of our investigation sits inside Syracuse between 214 and 212 BCE. You stand on a defensive wall above the harbor, watching Roman ships approach with the confidence of a republic that has grown accustomed to winning. Their commander, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, has soldiers, ships, siege plans, and the emotional stability of a man who believes numbers belong on tax records, not in weapons. Then the machines begin to move. From the walls, catapults release stones and bolts with brutal precision. Cranes swing outward over the water. Ships that thought that they were attacking a city suddenly feel themselves grabbed, lifted, tilted, smashed, or thrown into confusion by mechanisms they cannot fully see. The Romans came prepared for soldiers. Syracuse answers with geometry. This is where the old separation between abstract knowledge and battlefield violence quietly collapses. Archimedes was not merely a philosopher drawing circles in the sand while practical men handled war. He was a mathematician whose understanding of leverage, balance, distance, and force helped turn a besieged city into a mechanical problem for Rome. If these ancient accounts preserve even a disciplined core of truth, then Syracuse was not defended only by courage, walls, and patriotic speeches. It was defended by applied mathematics, very root of the numbers. The human anchor is Archimedes of Syracuse, mathematician, engineer, inventor, and reluctant military asset. The siege lasted from 214 to 212 BCE. The Roman commander was Marcus Claudius Marcellus. Ancient sources credit Archimedes with defensive catapults, cranes, grappling devices, and machines designed to strike Roman ships at varying ranges. Syracuse resisted Rome for roughly 2 years. The city finally fell in 212 BCE, and Archimedes was killed during the capture. The data cluster is narrow but heavy. 2 years of resistance. A major Roman siege. A Greek city under pressure. Mechanical artillery. Defensive cranes. Harbor warfare. A dead mathematician whose legend survived the empire that killed him. The physical contradiction is not that machines existed. Ancient armies knew machines. The contradiction is the concentration of intellectual force at a defensive crisis. Mathematics, usually remembered as clean abstraction, becomes dirty with military consequence. Geometry stops being a school exercise and begins deciding whether Roman sailors live long enough to complain about Greek philosophers. The engineering problem was severe. A wall-mounted defensive system had to account for distance, angle, projectile weight, tension, leverage, line of sight, and the unpredictable movement of ships. Catapults had to hit at different ranges. Cranes had to extend power outward beyond the wall. Grappling mechanisms, if the accounts are broadly reliable, had to interact with ships moving on water, an environment that does not politely hold still. The defenders needed not only machines, but calibration. That word matters. Calibration is the difference between a clever idea and a weapon. A stone thrown too short is theater. A hook dropped too late is decoration. A crane that cannot control load is suicide with carpentry. Archimedes' genius in the military story was not magic. It was the translation of principles into devices. Leverage became force multiplication. Geometry became targeting. Mechanical advantage became civic survival. Rome did not face a wizard. It faced an old man who understood that the universe has rules, and that some of those rules can be applied to enemy ships. This is precisely why power both needs and fears knowledge. Syracuse needed Archimedes because intellectual labor could compensate, temporarily, for Roman pressure. Rome feared the machines because they made the usual hierarchy unstable. Soldiers expect to fear stronger soldiers. Commanders expect to fear larger armies. It is much less satisfying to fear someone who has been thinking quietly about pulleys. The politics are almost too neat. Rome was expanding across the Mediterranean. Greek cities possessed enormous intellectual prestige but declining political independence. Rome admired Greek knowledge while absorbing Greek territory, a very efficient arrangement if one enjoys other people's libraries after defeating their governments. Syracuse became a case study in this relationship. Greek intellect resisted Roman force. Roman force eventually captured Greek intellect. The machines became legend. The annexation became policy. The dead scholar became useful. Later imperial memory could celebrate Archimedes safely because Syracuse was no longer independent. That is how conquest often digests brilliance. First the city falls. Then the conqueror praises its culture. Very generous. The victim is not available for comment. The Orthodox textbook version says Archimedes built clever defensive devices during the siege of Syracuse. This is fair, but weak. Clever devices is what one says about a dinner party trick or a toy that impresses visiting relatives. At Syracuse, the devices were not clever in the harmless sense. They altered Roman behavior. They delayed assault. They turned naval attack into an experiment in being struck, seized, dropped, or otherwise corrected by mathematics. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until one notices that Rome needed roughly 2 years to take the city. 2 years is a long time to be inconvenienced by gadgets. Of course, caution is necessary. Ancient sources loved drama. Later retellings amplified Archimedes into near myth. The claw, the burning mirrors, the lone genius humiliating Rome with pure intellect. Some details remain debated. The famous mirror story especially is treated skeptically by many historians. Sunlight is persuasive in poetry, less cooperative in battlefield logistics. But dismissing every account as fantasy creates another oversimplification. Syracuse did resist. Archimedes did exist. Ancient sources do credit him with machines. Roman fear of his devices appears as part of the tradition. The honest position is not blind belief or smug dismissal. It is disciplined suspicion. Separate the theatrical inventions of memory from the plausible core of advanced defensive engineering. One cautious hypothesis is that Archimedes improved existing artillery systems rather than inventing every machine from nothing. Another is that his reputation caused multiple defensive devices to be attributed to him, because history likes a single genius more than a workshop full of competent engineers. A third is that the psychological effect of his name became part of the defense itself. Once soldiers believe a city contains impossible machines, every shadow on the wall becomes hostile technology. The mainstream simplification also misses the institutional question. Why did Syracuse need Archimedes only at the edge of catastrophe? Why do states so often remember thinkers as ornamental until disaster turns them into infrastructure? And why are mathematicians praised after they are dead, when their advice is finally cheap? The question stack sharpens. Was Archimedes the miracle? Or was the miracle a city desperate enough to let mathematics command the walls? Did Rome defeat Greek science, or simply survive it long enough to own it? And if knowledge can delay an empire, what happens when knowledge has no army, no treasury, and no political shield? The cold takeaway is that intelligence without power is vulnerable, but power without intelligence is blunt. Syracuse held because it could borrow genius. Rome won because it could absorb what it survived. The empire did not need to understand Archimedes before the siege. It only needed to inherit the world after men like him were gone. From Syracuse, the trail enters a more standardized Roman machine. Not one genius on a wall, but crews, measurements, torsion bundles, bolts, frames, and an empire learning to make precision portable. Archimedes showed that mathematics could wound Rome. Rome, being Rome, eventually made sure calculation worked for the empire instead. Chapter 7. Roman Torsion Artillery. The empire's portable precision terror. Dossier number 7 opens at the edge of a Roman fort, where you stand beside a machine that looks less like a weapon than a carpenter's nightmare with excellent discipline. A wooden frame, arms drawn back under strain. Twisted bundles of sinew or hair packed into the mechanism like stored animal rage. A bolt rests in place aimed not at a crowd, but at a person. That is the unsettling part. Ancient warfare is often imagined as loud, crowded, and personal. Shields collide. Men shout. Swords rise. Dust covers everything. Then Roman torsion artillery enters the field and introduces a colder idea. Death delivered from a distance by calibrated tension. Not heroic, not intimate, very efficient. Naturally, empires approved. The human anchors are Vitruvius, the Roman architect and engineer whose writings describe artillery principles, and the anonymous crews who operated scorpiones, ballistae, and related machines across Roman battlefields, forts, sieges, and frontiers. Their world was not only courage, it was measurement, maintenance, replacement parts, twisted fiber, frame alignment, and the quiet professional terror of knowing that a machine can miss because someone failed to inspect it properly. The weapon category is Roman Torsion artillery. Vitruvius described the Scorpio in the 1st century BCE. These machines used torsion bundles, often made from sinew, hair, or other elastic organic fibers, twisted under tension to store energy. They fired bolts or stones with greater force than hand weapons. They appeared in field warfare, siege defense, fortifications, and later imperial accounts, including descriptions by Ammianus Marcellinus. Their battlefield identity was precision, range, and intimidation through mechanical force. The data cluster is compact but revealing. 1st century BCE technical description. Organic torsion bundles. Bolt-firing scorpions. Stone-throwing ballistae, and larger engines. Use across forts, sieges, and battlefields. Later literary confirmation in imperial warfare, a weapon system where biological material was twisted until it became stored violence. That is the paradox. Roman military dominance is usually reduced to legions, roads, discipline, and short swords. Those mattered. But torsion artillery adds another layer. Applied physics operating inside imperial logistics. The machine turned hair and sinew into energy storage. It turned carpentry into a delivery platform. It turned geometry into injury. A fine achievement for materials that began their careers attached to animals and people. The engineering was demanding. A torsion engine had to be built with proper proportions. The bundles had to be prepared, inserted, tightened, and adjusted. Humidity, wear, temperature, and repeated firing could alter performance. The frame had to withstand recoil. The projectile had to be shaped and loaded correctly. The crew had to aim, reload, maintain, and repair under pressure. A badly tuned machine was not terrifying. It was furniture with ambition. Precision required standard practice. That is what makes the Roman version important. Many civilizations used artillery. Rome absorbed, adapted, standardized, deployed, and maintained it across a wide military system. The machine did not exist in isolation. It belonged to forts, roads, supply chains, workshops, trained crews, manuals, commanders, and siege doctrine. Rome did not merely own machines. Rome organized machines. This mattered because artillery changed the psychology of resistance. A defender on a wall could be struck before close assault began. A gate could be targeted, a formation could be harassed. A commander could be reminded that distance was not safety. The enemy did not need to reach you with a sword to make your day administratively difficult. The politics are buried in the mechanism. Local resistance depended on familiar calculations. Wall height, gate strength, numbers of defenders, courage under assault. Roman artillery disrupted those calculations. It extended imperial reach before infantry contact. It made the approach to a Roman position more dangerous. It allowed forts to project controlled violence outward. The empire became not only a line of soldiers, but a network of machines capable of punishing exposure. And still, history prefers the legionary. The legionary is easy to remember. Shield, helmet, sword, formation, strong jawline, usually provided by modern illustrators with suspicious enthusiasm. The artillery technician is harder to romanticize. He adjusts tension. He checks parts. He calculates range. He kills someone the audience never meets. Very poor material for heroic sculpture, but excellent material for empire. This is the erasure layer. Romantic military storytelling likes bodies more than systems. It likes the soldier charging through dust. It likes the commander raising his arm. It likes the dramatic clash. The technician calibrating torsion tension is less cinematic, even when he may be the reason the heroic infantry survived long enough to do anything memorable. The machine disappears behind the man. The system disappears behind the symbol. The orthodox textbook explanation says Rome conquered through discipline, roads, logistics, and close order infantry. Again, not false. Rome did all of that, but the simplified version becomes too clean. It turns a combined military system into a moral fable about toughness. Rome was not frightening because every soldier was personally unbeatable. Rome was frightening because its violence had layers: infantry, cavalry, roads, engineers, siegecraft, artillery, supply, law, punishment, taxation, recruitment, and record-keeping all worked together with unpleasant patience. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until a bolt arrives from a machine before the sword fight begins. Short swords do not knock defenders from walls at range. Discipline does not by itself throw stones. Roads do not aim at a doorway. Torsion artillery fills the gap between Roman organization and Roman impact. It made Roman force more flexible, more intimidating, and more technically mature than the simple image of shield walls allows. The mainstream simplification also misses the biological strangeness of the technology. These machines depended on organic fibers. Hair and sinew were not incidental details. They were the energy core. Ancient artillery was not primitive because it used natural material. It was sophisticated because it understood how those materials behaved under strain. Modern people often confuse metal with intelligence. The Romans were less sentimental. If twisted hair stored energy, twisted hair became imperial infrastructure. Very glamorous, slightly unsettling, efficient enough to keep. Alternative hypotheses should stay cautious. One possibility is that Roman artillery's greatest effect was not always casualties, but suppression, forcing defenders away from exposed positions, disrupting morale, and shaping movement. Another is that its logistical value mattered more than its maximum power. Standardized machines in the right places could make Roman frontier control feel permanent. A third is that Torsion artillery became psychologically exaggerated by those who faced it, because a mechanical projectile feels impersonal in a way even a spear does not. A man throws a spear. A machine expresses policy. That distinction matters. A machine does not hate you. It does not know you. It simply completes the action built into it. This is why mechanical warfare feels colder than personal combat. It removes the emotional negotiation. The bolt does not care whether your cause is noble, so the questions begin their work. When an empire mechanizes precision, does courage become less important or simply more expensive? How much of Roman dominance came not from superior bravery, but from superior maintenance? And why do we remember the man with the sword more clearly than the crew whose machine made the sword safe to use? The independent lesson is blunt. Ancient warfare was not primitive chaos waiting for modernity to arrive. It was already full of calculation. Roman Torsion artillery proves that empire can be built from physics, biology, woodworking, logistics, and the quiet decision to make terror repeatable at range. But precision is not the only form of fear. Some weapons did not terrify because they were calibrated. They terrified because they were alive. From the measured frame of Roman artillery, the archive turns toward the battlefield at Hydaspes, where men looked across the line and saw not machines, not walls, not bolts, but elephants. Huge, trained, expensive, unstable, and carrying the oldest military problem in history. What happens when your weapon has a nervous system? Chapter 8. War Elephants. The living siege towers nobody could fully control. Number 8 begins at the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE. You stand in the mud before dawn, listening to rain, horses, metal, and the low animal thunder coming from the opposite line. At first, the shapes look like moving towers. Then the light improves, which is unfortunate. They are elephants. Not symbols, not parade animals, war elephants. Massive bodies trained into battlefield shock, carrying handlers, sometimes armor, sometimes towers, always the basic message that a normal infantryman is now expected to remain calm while several tons of muscle, bone, tusk, fear, and royal investment moves toward him. Alexander's men had faced cavalry, phalanxes, fortifications, deserts, rivers, and kings with excellent self-confidence. At the Hydaspes, King Porus gave them something different. A living weapon designed to break formation before killing even began. The elephant did not need to be subtle. Subtlety is not required when your military platform can step on a man and continue with its schedule. If this weapon is understood properly, war elephants were not simply ancient tanks. That comparison is tidy, common, and wrong in several useful ways. Tanks do not panic, require fodder, obey handlers inconsistently, or occasionally reverse into their own infantry with the emotional clarity of a collapsing empire. The object of this case is the war elephant as a military system. At the Battle of the Hydaspes, in 326 BCE, Porus reportedly deployed around 85 to 100 elephants against Alexander the Great. In the aftermath of Eastern imperial conflict, the Seleucid Mauryan settlement involved the transfer of 500 elephants to Seleucus. Elephants played a major role at Ipsus in 301 BCE. Hannibal crossed the Alps in 218 BCE with war elephants during the Second Punic War, although most did not survive long-term campaigning. These animals were not battlefield curiosities. They were strategic assets, diplomatic currency, royal symbols, logistical burdens, and psychological weapons. The data is heavy because the animal was heavy. 85 to 100 elephants at Hydaspes. 500 transferred in a major imperial settlement. Use at Ipsus in 301 BCE. Hannibal's Alpine crossing in 218 BCE, several tons per animal, enormous daily fodder requirements. Specialized handlers, capture networks, training regimes. Transport problems, the sort of weapon that begins terrifying the quartermaster long before it reaches the enemy. That is the contradiction. A war elephant was both weapon and animal. It could smash infantry, frighten cavalry horses, disrupt formations, and serve as a towering sign of royal power. But the same nervous system that made it trainable also made it unpredictable. Pain, noise, fire, blood, arrows, unfamiliar terrain, and panic could turn the weapon backward. Commanders weaponized fear, then had to hope fear followed instructions. Bold strategy, very mammalian. The engineering problem here is biological rather than mechanical. A siege engine can be repaired. A crossbow can be inspected. A torsion bundle can be tightened. An elephant must be captured, trained, fed, rested, guided, and kept from deciding that the entire battle is unacceptable. The mahout, the handler, was therefore not a minor accessory. He was the control system. Without him, the elephant became less a weapon than a mobile disaster with tusks. The animal's effect on cavalry was especially important. Horses unfamiliar with elephants could panic at the smell, size, and noise. Infantry formations could be crushed, opened, or psychologically broken. An elephant line could create gaps, disorder, and hesitation. Even when casualties were not decisive, the emotional effect could be enormous. A soldier facing an elephant was not merely facing danger, he was facing scale. Human beings are brave, but they remain human beings. At a certain height and mass, philosophy becomes less persuasive. Yet the politics of elephants mattered as much as battlefield impact. War elephants signaled royal access to distant resources. They required territories where elephants could be captured or obtained, systems of trainers and handlers, expensive supply chains, and courtly display. They were living evidence that a ruler controlled more than men. He controlled nature, or at least had persuaded nature to appear in uniform. This is why elephants were tied to kingship. Porus used them against Alexander. Hellenistic successor kingdoms coveted them. Mauryan power could trade them as geopolitical assets. Carthage used them as symbols of reach and shock. Elephants made power visible. They turned the battlefield into theater before the first spear landed. The problem, of course, is that theater can trample the caste. The decline of elephants in many Mediterranean contexts came from a combination of countermeasures, tactical adaptation, logistics, and the difficulty of controlling them under changing battlefield conditions. Troops learned to open lanes, use missiles, target handlers, exploit panic, or avoid giving elephants dense formations to smash cleanly. Better discipline and anti-elephant tactics reduced their shock value. The weapon remained impressive, but impressive is not the same as consistently useful. History often remembers elephants as exotic spectacle because spectacle is easier than system. The image is unforgettable. Hannibal crossing the Alps, Porus facing Alexander, massive animals in armor or towers. The deeper machine behind the image is less romantic. Fodder, routes, veterinary care, capture, training, handlers, heat, terrain, panic management, and the uncomfortable truth that royal prestige sometimes arrives hungry. The orthodox textbook explanation says, war elephants were ancient tanks. It sounds useful for 5 seconds, which is the usual lifespan of a bad analogy. Tanks are armored mechanical vehicles with engines, crews, fuel systems, and no personal opinions about drums. Elephants were intelligent animals under stress. They could obey, resist, panic, charge, stop, turn, or die in ways that affected both armies. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the tank becomes frightened and walks backward through friendly troops. The tank comparison also hides the real innovation. The elephant's greatest power was not armor, it was psychological mass. A man can understand a spear. He can understand a sword. He can even understand a catapult stone, briefly. But an elephant forces the battlefield to confront animal scale. It makes discipline biological. Do you hold the line because your commander ordered it? Or do you move because your body has voted against the plan? The body often wins. Alternative readings are necessary. One possibility is that war elephants were most effective against armies unprepared for them, and declined once opponents developed tactics and emotional familiarity. Another is that their symbolic value often exceeded their practical reliability, making them as much royal propaganda as battlefield technology. A third is that elephants were used not because commanders misunderstood their risks, but because the reward could be decisive when conditions were right. A broken cavalry wing, a shattered infantry line, or a terrified enemy center could justify enormous expense. Still, the paradox remains. The elephant was a weapon that could not fully stop being itself. That is why the case is so revealing. It exposes a mistake older than empire, confusing terror with control. Rulers love terrifying weapons because terror appears to simplify politics. Make the enemy afraid, and the problem seems solved. But fear is unstable. It spreads, reflects, mutates, and occasionally returns home with tusks. So the questions press forward. When commanders use living beings as weapons, where does technology end and arrogance begin? Did kings deploy elephants because they were tactically necessary, or because power always wants to be seen from a distance? And if a weapon can terrify both enemy and owner, who is actually commanding whom? The cold lesson is that fear is not obedience. War elephants could break armies, but they could also reveal the fragility of every command system built on spectacle. The animal carried kingship, logistics, and panic on the same back. A living siege tower, yes. Also a reminder that nature does not become state property just because a ruler paints it. From the elephant line, the investigation moves back into machinery, but not the machinery of elite states alone. The next weapon is smaller, less majestic, and far less royal. It does not need several tons of muscle or a king's parade. It needs a lever, a magazine, bolts, and a user who may not be an elite archer at all. After the fear of living shock comes another kind of threat, repeated fire made accessible. Chapter 9. The Repeating Crossbow. Ancient China's mechanical rate of fire problem. Item number 9 begins not in a royal parade, but near a defended wall, a village gate, or a cramped passage where elegance has already left the room. You stand beside a person who is not trying to become a legendary archer. He is not posing for a bronze statue. He is trying to survive the next few minutes with a wooden weapon, a top-mounted magazine, a stack of bolts, and a lever that turns fear into rhythm. Push, pull, release, again, again, again. The weapon does not ask for the lifelong discipline of an elite bowman. It does not promise the raw force of a heavy siege crossbow. It offers something less romantic and more practical. Repeated fire from a simplified mechanical cycle. In a crisis, romance is nice. Volume is better. The weapon is the repeating crossbow, often associated in later tradition with Zhuge Liang and the name Zhuge Nu, though earlier forms predate him. The stronger human anchor may be an unknown craftsman from Chu or the Warring States world, someone who looked at the separate actions of spanning, loading, and firing, and asked a dangerous question: why not combine them? Archaeological evidence for early repeating crossbow forms appears in the state of Chu around the 4th century BCE. Later designs used a top-mounted magazine. The mechanism compressed loading and firing into one repeated lever action. It remained in use in various forms through much of Chinese history. It was generally less powerful than standard crossbows, but faster in repeated shooting. That is the data cluster. 4th century BCE, state of Chu evidence. Lever action, magazine feeding. Combined spanning, loading, and firing. Lower power, higher rate of fire, long survival across Chinese military and civilian defensive contexts. The physical contradiction is simple. Ancient ranged weapons usually required separate actions. Prepare the projectile, draw or span the weapon, aim, fire, then begin again. The repeating crossbow compressed that sequence. It sacrificed force and precision for speed and accessibility. This makes it less impressive in a heroic duel, which is fortunate because actual defensive violence is not usually arranged for the convenience of heroic duels. The engineering insight was not maximum power, it was workflow. A standard crossbow can store more energy, drive bolts harder, and penetrate better. But the repeating crossbow attacked a different problem. What if the user is not an elite soldier? What if the distance is short? What if the target is approaching a doorway, wall, boat, alley, or defensive position? What if the point is not to kill one armored professional at long range, but to make forward movement expensive, chaotic, and deeply unattractive? Then speed matters. The mechanism had to coordinate several actions. A magazine held bolts above the weapon. The lever movement helped draw the string, drop a bolt into position, and release. The result was a weapon that could fire repeatedly with less training than many traditional bows demanded. Its weakness was obvious: shorter effective range, lower penetration, less refined accuracy. Its strength was equally obvious. It allowed users to produce repeated threat under pressure. This is where the politics become interesting. The repeating crossbow threatened the romance of elite martial skill. Societies love master archers because they make violence look noble. The years of practice, the perfect stance, the steady breath, the graceful release, all very useful for songs, murals, and aristocratic self-respect. A repeating crossbow is less poetic. It is mechanical, repetitive, accessible, almost rude. It does not ask whether the user belongs to a warrior lineage. It asks whether the lever is moving. Naturally, elite narratives tend to dislike that sort of thing. The weapon's reputation has often suffered because it does not win the comparison people force upon it. Against a powerful military crossbow, it is weaker. Against a skilled long-range archer, it is cruder. Against armor, it may struggle. Therefore, the simplified judgment arrives. A weak peasant weapon. Case closed. Very tidy. Also very lazy. Weak compared to what? Weak compared to a siege engine? Yes. Weak compared to doing nothing while someone enters your courtyard? Absolutely not. Weak compared to a heavy crossbow and battlefield penetration? Certainly. Weak compared to panic, confusion, and a doorway suddenly filling with bolts? The debate becomes less comfortable. The orthodox textbook explanation frames the repeating crossbow as a clever but limited Chinese weapon, useful mainly because of its rate of fire, but not decisive because of low power. That is fair as far as it goes. The weapon did have limitations. It was not a universal battlefield solution. It did not make elite archery irrelevant. It did not turn every farmer into a professional soldier. The problem is that this explanation often treats limitation as failure. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the context changes from open battlefield glory to close defensive panic. Because weapons must be judged by the problem they were designed to solve. A kitchen knife is a terrible spear. This does not make it a failed weapon in a kitchen. The repeating crossbow was not built to satisfy a modern weapons collector comparing penetration charts in a comfortable chair. It was built for practical threat, rapid use, and situations where speed could compensate for individual skill. The systemic layer is even colder. A weapon like this lowers the threshold of violence. It gives less specialized users a way to defend space. That can be militarily useful and politically uncomfortable. Elite power often depends on the idea that dangerous competence belongs only to trained specialists. Mechanical simplification insults that idea. The repeating crossbow does not fully democratize war, but it moves in that direction. It gives ordinary hands a machine that can create repeated danger. That is why accessible weapons are always politically interesting. They change who can threaten whom. They change how gates, homes, boats, walls, and narrow passages are defended. They make violence less dependent on lifelong skill and more dependent on design. Every society has authorities that prefer weapons to remain complex enough for approved users only. History is full of people who dislike being surprised by armed amateurs. The erasure layer comes from aesthetics. The repeating crossbow is not majestic. It does not have the terrifying grandeur of Greek fire or elephants. It does not have the imperial polish of Qin bronze standardization. It does not even have the brutal elegance of Roman artillery. It is boxy, practical, repetitive, and slightly undignified. History often mistakes undignified for unimportant. A common mistake. Humans also invented paperwork. Alternative readings should remain careful. One hypothesis is that the repeating crossbow's main value was defensive saturation, creating enough repeated fire to slow, frighten, or disrupt attackers in confined spaces. Another is that its historical endurance came from ease of use rather than battlefield supremacy, making it a weapon of practicality rather than prestige. A third is that later association with Zhuge Liang gave the weapon a famous name, while obscuring the deeper tradition of anonymous craftsmen who solved mechanical problems without receiving statues, titles, or convenient legends. That last point matters. Innovation is often attributed upward. Rulers, generals, and famous strategists collect credit the way roofs collect rain. But a repeating mechanism does not appear because a great man is great. It appears because craftsmen experiment, users complain, materials are tested, and someone notices that the human hand can perform several actions in one motion if the machine is designed properly. The weapon is therefore a small rebellion against historical vanity. It reminds us that not all technological breakthroughs arrive from palaces, imperial arsenals, or named geniuses. Some come from workshops, borderlands, village defenses, and practical fear. Especially fear. Fear is an excellent design consultant, very demanding, rarely satisfied. So the questions begin to cut deeper. Why do historians admire maximum power more than practical accessibility? When a weapon allows ordinary users to become dangerous, is that technological progress or a political problem? And how many inventions have been dismissed as crude simply because they served people who did not control the official story? The cold lesson is that innovation is not always about making the strongest weapon. Sometimes it is about making threat repeatable, usable, and available. The repeating crossbow did not need to dominate the grand battlefield to matter. It only needed to make the next step forward feel unwise. From this compact machine of accessible fear, the investigation reaches its final file. The setting shifts forward in time, into the age of European empire, where technological superiority was supposed to flow in one direction, outward from Europe, downward onto everyone else. Then Mysore fired iron-cased rockets at the British East India Company, and the empire discovered a very old educational method, being hit by the lesson first. Chapter 10. Mysorean Rockets. The iron tubes that frightened an empire into copying them. The final file opens in southern India, in the smoke of the Anglo-Mysore Wars. You stand near the lines of Mysore as iron tubes are packed, aimed, and prepared for launch against the British East India Company. Across the field, British officers watch with the confidence of men employed by an empire that has confused profit with destiny. Then the rockets rise. They do not behave like polite artillery. They scream, arc, wobble, burst, scatter, and turn the air itself into uncertainty. Horses panic, formations hesitate. Soldiers trained to believe that European war represented the advanced edge of military order now face a weapon that refuses to fit their favorite story about civilization. The lesson arrives loudly. It is made of iron. If this case is understood honestly, then the history of modern rocketry cannot be narrated as a clean European invention story. Mysore, under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, developed and deployed iron-cased military rockets with enough effect that the British did what empires often do after being frightened by foreign technology. They captured it, studied it, improved it, renamed the lesson, and filed it under progress. The weapon is the Mysorean rocket. It appeared during the Anglo-Mysore Wars of the late 18th century. Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan used rocket corps against the British East India Company. The key technical feature was the iron casing, which allowed higher internal pressure than many paper-cased European rockets of the period. Reported ranges reached roughly 2 kilometers. Mysorean rockets were used at Srirangapattam in 1792 and again in 1799. After Tipu's defeat, captured rockets and related knowledge influenced William Congreve's British rockets in the early 19th century. There is the data cluster. Late 18th century. Iron casing, roughly 2-kilometer range. Srirangapattam, 1792 and 1799. Hyder Ali, Tipu Sultan, British capture, Congreve adaptation. A non-European weapon system powerful enough to become European after conquest, which is a very convenient transformation. The physical contradiction is direct. European imperial narratives likes to place technology on one side of the map and backwardness on the other. Mysorean rockets disrupted that geometry. Their iron tubes allowed stronger combustion pressure, greater range, and a battlefield effect that was not merely physical, but psychological. They were not perfectly accurate. That was part of the terror. A cannonball follows a more predictable argument. A rocket behaves like a burning complaint with directional ambitions. To dismiss them as noisy curiosities misses the point. The point was shock, disruption, range, and morale. The rocket did not need to hit every target precisely to change the behavior of troops under fire. It only needed to make order feel temporary. Armies are built on rhythm. Rockets broke rhythm. The engineering mattered. A rocket casing had to withstand combustion without bursting immediately. The propellant had to produce useful thrust. The stick or guiding structure had to offer some stability. Manufacturing had to support repeated deployment. Crews had to launch them in numbers, coordinate use, transport materials, and integrate them into broader tactics. This was not random fireworks with military aspirations, it was organized rocket warfare. Very upsetting for people who preferred their advanced technology to arrive with European paperwork. The politics are impossible to separate from the weapon. Mysore was resisting the British East India Company, an institution that acted like a government, an army, a corporation, and a hunger with an accounting department. Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali used military modernization to defend sovereignty against expanding colonial power. Their rockets threatened not only British soldiers, but British mythology. The empire's story required technological hierarchy. Mysore complicated the script. That is why the erasure matters. After Tipu's defeat at Srirangapattam in 1799, British forces captured rockets and studied them. William Congreve later developed British rockets influenced by these examples. In the imperial retelling, innovation migrates smoothly into Britain and becomes part of British military progress. The Indian origin remains present in specialist histories, but popular memory often blurs it into the background. The empire first feared the weapon, then it inherited the weapon, then it stood closer to the microphone, a familiar procedure. The orthodox textbook explanation often says modern military rocketry developed in Europe, with Congreve rockets becoming a major step in early 19th century warfare. This is not wholly false. Congreve's work mattered. British industrial production and military adoption mattered. European states did expand and systematize rocket warfare. But the clean version becomes suspiciously tidy when it forgets the captured Mysorean iron rockets sitting at the beginning of the chain. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the empire is found copying the enemy's homework. The simplification fails because it mistakes publication for origin and imperial adoption for invention. Empires are excellent at turning other people's knowledge into official advancement. First, the foreign weapon is exotic. Then it is dangerous. Then it is captured. Then it becomes research material. Then it reappears under imperial branding, now described as innovation rather than appropriation. Very efficient. Morally aerodynamic. Cautious alternatives make the picture clearer. One hypothesis is that Mysorean rockets were most effective as psychological and disruptive weapons rather than precision instruments. Another is that their importance lies not in creating modern rocketry alone, but in demonstrating a technical path that British engineers then adapted under industrial conditions. A third is that colonial narratives minimized Mysorean agency because admitting technological dependence on a defeated Indian power made the imperial story less flattering. An empire hates an unflattering mirror. So the final questions do not stay inside Mysore. They spread across the whole archive. Who gets remembered as the inventor when the battlefield, the workshop, and the conquest all tell different stories? How many weapons were labeled primitive until the victorious side found a use for them? And if progress is written by the people who captured the machines, how much of history is really a receipt with the original owner's name scratched off? The cold answer is not that every ancient or pre-modern weapon was magical, superior, or misunderstood by modern scholars. That would be another fantasy, just wearing a darker coat. The stronger conclusion is more severe. These weapons terrified empires because they exposed imperial assumptions as fragile. Water would protect ships, walls would protect cities. Heavy armies would dominate mobile riders. Aristocrats would preserve elite violence. Naval skill would decide sea battles. Rome would crush Greek cities quickly. Soldiers with swords would define conquest. Elephants would obey terror. Power would remain specialized. Europe would own the future. Each weapon broke one assumption. Greek fire made the sea burn. Assyrian siege systems made walls temporary. Scythian bows made distance political. Qin crossbows made bureaucracy lethal. The Corvus made naval tradition negotiable. Archimedes made mathematics bleed into war. Roman artillery made precision portable. War elephants made fear visible and uncontrollable. The repeating crossbow made threat accessible. Mysorean rockets made colonial arrogance look upward at incoming fire. If you made it this far, you are not watching history as a bedtime story. You are watching for cracks. That matters. The linear textbook narrative is comforting because it makes power look orderly after the bodies have been removed. But the machines tell a colder story. Empires survive by controlling fear, and they panic when someone else learns how to manufacture it. Subscribe to Minimal Histories if you prefer your history with fewer bedtime stories and more evidence under interrogation. And defend your theory in the comments. Which weapon was the most terrifying? The one that burned, the one that broke walls, or the one empire copied after pretending it was superior? Because the final pattern is simple. Civilizations remember kings because kings paid for monuments. But the machines made the monuments possible. The weapon disappears into footnotes. The ruler gets the statue. Predictable, almost elegant, completely suspicious. Otro, the machines behind the monuments. If you made it this far, you are not watching history as a bedtime story. You are watching for cracks. That matters. The linear textbook narrative is comfortable because it makes civilization look orderly after the smoke has cleared. The bodies have been removed, and the winners have hired someone literate enough to write the official version. But these 10 weapons tell a colder story. Greek fire did not merely burn ships. It turned secrecy into state power. Assyrian siege engines did not merely break walls. They made sovereignty look temporary. Scythian bows did not merely shoot arrows. They mocked the imperial fantasy that every enemy could be pinned down, taxed, mapped, and punished on schedule. Qin crossbows did not merely fire bolts. They showed what happens when bureaucracy discovers ballistics. The Corvus proved that Rome could win by refusing the enemy's rules. Archimedes proved that mathematics could make an empire bleed. Roman Torsion artillery proved that ancient warfare was not primitive chaos, but applied physics with supply chains. War elephants proved that terror is not the same thing as control. The repeating crossbow proved that accessibility can be more dangerous than elegance. And Mysorean rockets proved that empires often call a weapon primitive right up until they capture it, copy it, and reintroduce it under better branding. Very efficient. Completely shameless. So the central question is not whether ancient weapons were secretly magical. They were not. The stronger answer is more disturbing. These weapons terrified empires because they exposed the fragile assumptions empires depended on. That walls would hold, oceans would protect, cavalry would charge, enemies would fight conventionally, elite violence would stay elite, and technological superiority would always belong to the people writing the history books. Each weapon broke one assumption, and when an assumption breaks, power panics. That is why civilizations remember kings more easily than machines. Kings leave statues, inscriptions, coins, tombs, portraits, official titles, and long speeches about destiny. Machines leave fragments, technical descriptions, scorched ships, broken walls, copied designs, and the quiet suspicion that the ruler was never the true engine of history. The king gives the order. The weapon changes the world. Subscribe to Minimal Histories if you prefer history with fewer bedtime stories and more evidence under interrogation. And defend your theory in the comments. Which weapon was the most terrifying? The secret flame, the wall-breaking machine, the living shock weapon, or the rocket? An empire copied after pretending it was superior. Because history is not just the story of who ruled, it is the story of what made ruling possible. And that part is usually kept much quieter.